This is Decolonizing the Music Room, nonprofit 501c3 organization, and our mission is to center Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian voices, experiences, knowledge, and identities within the field of music education. And I am so incredibly happy to be joined again with the same panelists as before. I'm going to give us a sec to introduce ourselves, and then I'll let Alice talk about why we're here again. So I am Brandi Waller-Pace, founder, executive director of Decolonizing the Music Room. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm an old-time musician. I am currently a PhD student at the University of North Texas, and just doing all the things in the quarantine.
I'm Syreeta Neal. I am a musician, singer songwriter, and music educator based here in Los Angeles, originally from Toronto, Canada. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and just excited to have another conversation about all the things that I spend all my time thinking about.
Hi everyone, my name is Lorelei Batislaong. I am the Deputy Director of Decolonizing the Music Room, she, her, hers. I am a PhD student at the University of Texas at Austin, and just making do with what we're doing and waking up and doing things and then going to bed and sleeping and just kind of rinse and repeat and all that good jazz. So
I'm Alice Tsui, she, her, hers. I am a pianist and music educator in Brooklyn, New York City. Brooklyn, yeah. And I teach elementary school. I'm a founding music educator at New Bridges Elementary in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. And I am a doctoral candidate at Boston University. And I also am in quarantine and teaching in person. So live and online and all of the fun.
Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Mena, currently a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, Seattle. I'm also a middle school orchestra and guitar teacher. Yeah, excited to be here for round two. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be talking about today. Oh, my pronouns are he, him, his.
My name is John Grimsley, he, him, his, and I am also in Brooklyn, New York. And I teach middle school music at a private Quaker school for students with learning disabilities. I teach a modern band program and chorus mostly. And yeah, just like everyone else, I'm really, really excited to continue this conversation that we started a few months ago. Yeah, that's all.
Thank y'all so much. I wanted to ask a couple of things just because we've been talking about it a lot. Um, Identification points that you tend to share, positionality wise, and then we've been talking about decolonization and land. When I talk to my undergrad students, I let them know that we're on the unceded lands of the Wichita and affiliated tribes down here where DTMR is based in Fort Worth, Texas. And I talk to them about the land being the way it is through settler aggression and genocidal policies and broken treaties, and that the Wichita and affiliated tribes are now, their reservations located in Oklahoma. And as an educator, I feel like that's an important thing. We talk a lot about land acknowledgments and not wanting them to be trite because they're just an intro, but that's something that's important. And then positionality wise, I identify as a cisgender black woman who is an American descendant of enslaved people. And I tend to lead with that. And externally, when I walk through the world as black in America, that's what people are looking at me as.
yeah, so if I was to lead with my positionality, I would also go with cisgender. Also, a daughter of immigrants is usually what I kind of lead with, talking about my parents coming from the Philippines and being a Filipino, but raised here in the United States. So lots of ideas about colonialism and how that has affected my idea of my own identification and how I go through the world, and currently kind of deconstructing that in my own understanding and learning.
I identify as Asian American, specifically ABC or American-born Chinese. I'm also a daughter of immigrants to parents who came from China to America. So I think a lot about what they have gone through as people who have gone through the Cultural Revolution in China and how that has shaped their identity and ultimately mine through generational trauma and things of that sort. And I also acknowledge that I'm on Munsee, Lenape, and Canarsie land. That is where I teach and also where I reside.
So my positionality, I identify as Black biracial, also a descendant of American chattel slavery. My mother is Italian Canadian. My father is Black American. And growing up in Canada, there's a lot of different identifying aspects of my positionality because I am both Black Canadian and Black American. I don't necessarily identify as mixed or biracial most of the time, just because when I move through the world, I'm not looked at as, oh, she's got a white mother and a Black father. I'm typically read as a Black woman or woman of color. So I identify as both, but for the most part, I identify as a cisgender Black Canadian and American woman.
So my key ID points are I'm a Chicano cisgender man. I am specifically third generation, and so in Mexican American communities, that the third generation that tends to be the generation that has been more assimilated, and deculturized. And so yeah, I've lived my life with that, and and I'm processing my experiences as a kid, and which got me interested in my research topic. So, but yeah, that's what I identify as. And I want to acknowledge that I'm on unceded Duwamish territory here in Seattle, Washington.
I guess my identifiers would be mostly cis, white, queer man. And I am on Canarsie and Lenape land. And yeah, I think a part of my identifier is also like a millennial or a young person. I think that's also because I think like as I get older, I think I'm going to be received differently than I am now. I don't get taken seriously by a lot of like colleagues because of my age, because I'm young. So I think that is also an important identifier for myself.
Thanks for bringing up age. That's yeah, and I tend to get read differently age wise, and how I get responded to based on how I look age wise can vary so widely, especially depending on the community. Like, I'm a jazz musician. Looking the age I look in the jazz community, I get treated a different way than going to an old time like trad something and looking the age I look. So this second panel was really something that grew out of what you brought up, Alice. Just looking at online interactions, the way we've been engaging with teachers. I want to know if you could talk a bit more about what you've noticed that led us to all be together today.
Sure. So I'm so excited to chat about this because we are now many months after COVID has really taken charge of the world and everything that has happened, as well as American racism pervading and continuing to pervade our society. So I have definitely noticed that on Facebook and just in online platforms, Instagram, etc., that many educators have done their required reading and read all the possible books that there are on race and history and what to say, what not to say. Let's call out this, let's call out that. And we are suddenly woke and that we have done our due diligence, but we're not. We have so much ways to go. If anything, it is just a beginning or a continuance of where we have been before. So I am excited to just hear everyone and its experiences and what they have seen themselves or experienced post awakening.
And I want to invite you, you don't have to stay muted if you don't want to, you know. For those of us, for those that are watching, we all actually really are buddies in real life, so we will get into it talking. So you're welcome to just, you know, have at it. I can relate to that idea that you say, Alice, is kind of a post something, right? And it's interesting as a black person to like experience the visceral terror of events that happen in the spring and the visceral terror of events that have happened recently, with the domestic terrorism that we've seen committed by white nationalists within the Capitol. And there's like this undercurrent of something that I don't know that everyone really understands, has not been erased, has not gone away, right?
Right. It's almost like as if the act of buying a book or picking up to read the book is the work, right? And that's just kind of how far you're going to go with it, instead of actually following through with actually embodying what you read, applying what you read, seeing it happen in the real world and calling it out, like all those things.
And when DTMR presents, we say, you know, we're not going to hand you a list and then you go check, 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 and there's an endpoint, right? And I think there are some educators who are looking for the relief of an endpoint. Like, what is the thing that I could have done so I did it, right? And we talked last time, I think, a lot about song lists and stuff, right? And you could kind of feel this collective thing within the community, like, if we fix these song lists, we are good. And there's so much deeper stuff than that, right? That's just fruit, not the root, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of it is if we think of it in terms of we're shifting our thinking and our perspective, right? And a person's thinking never ends, as long as they're breathing and living. And our perspective is not a finite thing either. And so if we think, if we start thinking in terms of all I have to do is learn the things, apply them, and we're good, you're stunting not only your own growth but the growth of the community around you. So it's really just kind of like having grace with yourself and understanding I'm always thinking, I'm always shifting, I'm always analyzing, observing, and taking in different perspectives and kind of figuring out where to go with those things and always asking questions.
Not to bring up the lists that go around of like, here's the list of minstrel songs you shouldn't be singing, because unfortunately that conversation is still happening. But what I find interesting is the comment that always happens, and it's still happening, is, well, where does it end? You know, like, you're going to take all this stuff. It's like, you are so close to approaching the point. Where does it end? Oh, keep digging because it gets worse, you know? And I think people, you know, well, I, you know, had a Black Composer of the Month last month, and it wasn't even Black History Month. And I think they're still looking for like validation and a pat on the back. It's like, well, I did that work. Notice that work that I did. And it's still about them. You know, they haven't done any of the work of decentering themselves. And I think that is getting more and more obvious as we have seen little to no change from this spring. And with Black History Month on the horizon, you know, the conversations are swelling again because everyone, you know, forgot about Black Lives Matter after they posted their Black Square. And now it's time to kick it up again, without having really done any work since then. Yeah, it's a journey, not a destination.
It's interesting you bring up the Black Square because, you know, the quarantine and everything has forced so much virtual interaction. It's been growing and growing. And I've kind of gotten to that point where, like, I see the Black Square or I see that ring, that Black Lives Matter ring, and I'm just like, what does it represent anymore? Because it is that, yeah, like we did a thing
It's
and the
performative.
thing's done. Yeah. And there are people that I know who post that, but I know what they're actually doing in a good way. Like, you can tell that they really have looked mindset wise at what they could do differently, whether they made mistakes or whatever. But it's almost like we had safety pins, we had like rainbow ally stuff, and it's like it's almost more dangerous, right? To have some kind of signal where you can feel a little sense of safety, and then to have that betrayed because you learn that whoever extended that doesn't really understand the foundational change that needs to happen to have any safety in that area.
I can absolutely relate to that. I've experienced that a lot where it kind of is like when somebody says, I'm a safe person, you want to go, oh, okay, cool. And it is a little bit disorienting when, that visual doesn't necessarily reflect the words or the actions. And so then it becomes about what is that visual really signaling in a concrete way about how we're moving through the world. And I don't know what the answer is to that. Do you not do it? Do you do it and like, I don't really know where to go with that, but I do know it just in my own personal and visceral experience that I have gotten to a point where the safety pin for sure, I'm like, and those different profile pictures and stuff, to me, almost as Lorelai said, the performativeness of it makes me a little bit reserved, and that's just me.
I want to quote Goldie Muhammad when she breaks down woke as we obtain knowledge every day, which I wish that everyone would just say that instead of the word woke, because wokeness, without that being broken apart, is performative. And I've also just personally thought of being anti-racist, or the act of continuing to be anti-racist, as something that you actively navigate thinking internally every day. Yet, as Syreeta, you named, like, that there is that push and pull of like, okay, I'm thinking about it, but then like, where does the square, where does that, this post come in? And I know we've talked about it, aside from this, but just so much of it happens offline. And because we are in such a digital world, it's hard to create that divide. But when I think about those things, it's not like, okay, now let me just write exactly what I feel on the internet 1 second after I've had this light bulb moment. It's a constant renewal of thinking, and then how does that actually take into action with my peers, my students, fellow educators?
I wanted to speak to that point really quick, because I've been involved in this project in Seattle Public Schools, just addressing that point. Like, how do we take all of this information and put it into action? And so over the summer, this all-star team of just these, Black, Indigenous, Brown, Asian educators, and artists came together, and we created this document called the Roots document. And our whole purpose about this is to get people to do that constant reflection every single day, with the understanding that this is an ongoing process, And so we came up with this list of questions that you ask yourself every day to consistently refine your thinking. There's writing exercises there, because, until people actually start like taking an internal inventory of like where you are like today, you're not going to be able to see your growth through this, and and you're not going to make any growth. So you have to work on this every single day. And so that's one point of action that we've done, here in Seattle, just understanding that, a lot of people, they want to read the books and say like, I've read it, and here's my BLM pin, and here I am, and I'm happy, and I'm woke. But no, it takes a lot of work to get there.
And when you've never been asked to do that reflection, and to be asked to do it constantly, that's something too.
That time element is just such a big thing, right? Maybe we present for an hour, maybe we present for a couple of hours. But that idea that something really does have to happen time after time, and that sometimes it's repetitive. It's just so interesting to see educators who would like run pentatonic scales class after class after class, right? But if you're supposed to talk about racism workshop after workshop after workshop, it's like, oh, well, we've heard that already. Like, it's, just that understanding that processing takes so long, and that there's meaning in it, right? So repeating a scale or something like that seems like valid instructional repetition. But even like the sitting down and like talking with our peers and talking with students about these core things and having that dialogue and having to sit and chew on it isn't given that same amount of value for the time. It people treat it like nothing's really happening, and I think it kind of speaks to a little bit of like ways of knowing and standards of knowledge construction. I remember I was in the classroom until last year, 11 and a half years till last year. And I had no issue with like a student says a thing and I'm like, oh, that's really cool. We're going to sit and we're going to actually deal with that thing. It's okay that we didn't pull the instruments out 10 minutes earlier than I intended to, because this is also learning, right?
It's collaborative. And I think that that's you hit on something really important in terms of this idea that we have to go in with either a script or this is, the rundown, the lesson plan, for example. And it does kind of create these arbitrary boxes for us where collaboration is about being present in the moment and improvisation and making connections, whether it's in a workshop in a professional development setting where you're collaborating with the people there. So it's not just talking at people or them talking at you. And then that translates to the classroom as well. And I think for me personally, that's something that has come very naturally to me as a person who was a musician first, and a musician first in very improvisational dominant settings, right? I learned how to play music through jamming with people and picking up the instrument and having to figure it out on the fly. And so that flexibility, I think, is a really huge asset when we think about how to collaborate with our students, collaborate with our colleagues, and not going into it going, this is my role, this is what I'm coming to give them. But really kind of like, okay, we're here. And in that way you avoid having to think about, okay, it's the same thing every single time. Everybody's different. Every experience is going to be different. If you are able to be present, vulnerable, and open and flexible in those environments, I think.
Also, the idea of just like letting things breathe and letting things breathe in silence, right? So we think as teachers, everything, every single minute has to be filled with some sort of sound, some sort of action, some sort of engaged something going on, right? Some kinetic energy. When this kind of work we're asking to do of ourselves is very internal. Like, I'm not going to be moving around while I'm thinking about what I'm doing oppressive to somebody else. I'm going to be sitting there, I'm going to be thinking. So we have to kind of reshift how we think about that and what it looks like, and that it maybe doesn't look like what we think learning is. And so that's why we need to be okay with it if it looks different.
And I just want to speak to that, just like the messiness of, this, it's okay to be messy. You know what I mean? Like, like learning isn't linear. Like, I mean, it's this messy process, and yeah, just being able to sit with that, like you said, that's something that I've accepted, in recent years, just about teaching. It's like, it's going to be messy. It's all right, but we're going to get somewhere afterwards, and we're all going to be, as long as everybody is invested in the messy process,
But you can't be wrong, right? That's the thing people are scared of too. Like, I can't be wrong. I'm the teacher, like,
And I have to be honest, it's quite terrifying, right? And I know some of us have talked about this, especially, I keep saying online interactions. We're talking a lot online. It just is what it is, right? This idea, just speaking as a Black woman, a racially minoritized person, of having white educators talk to me about their the stress and disequilibrium of having to confront these issues, and they talk about like mental health, and they talk about all of these things, and I'm like, you do realize I'm Black in America also with mental health, right? So I don't purposefully not talk about that, but it's just really interesting to hear educators talk about things like anxiety and depression and stuff like that, but they talk about it in a way where it's like, but you're so strong, and I'm like, we have the same mental health proclivities as people who are white guys. Like, we're not super people, but it's not even framed as if like it's we deal with this because we have to, and we don't have the option, not because we have a particular strength, and it even like it's not music ed, but I talk about this sometimes. That idea of some inherent strength that allows you to deal with more just really awful stuff. It's even medical, right? You can find medical literature written to say that like black people tolerate pain better than white people, and then women as well. And so like it's just so incredibly pervasive that the oppression that we go through has something to do with like our inherent ability to deal with more oppression. It's really really messed up.
I think you just set off a whole bunch of things in my brain, because that really does kind of bring me back to this idea of how we teach about Black music and Black history in the music classroom, and how much of that informs how Black children who grow up to be Black adults are seen as being like these people who are formed in struggle. Like, we are resilient and we are strong because, as far back as anybody is willing to include in their curriculum, we've always been like the bearers of oppression. And so it doesn't leave a lot of room for that tenderness and um, that tender approach. When I think Brandi, it's possible that a lot of that has to do with why we are sort of seen as the default is that we're strong, or that we're survivors, or that we are, resilient and fortified. And that doesn't leave a lot of room for our own ability to be seen as vulnerable, and to be seen as people who also struggle and deal with these issues, health wise, mental health wise. So so much of it, I think, goes back to like, how do we frame our conversations around BBIA people, and the humanness, right, versus they are part of this culture. This is what this culture has experienced. Therefore, this culture is strong, or this culture is creative, or, you know.
I sort of also think it kind of gives leeway to forgive the actual oppression that happened, and we can just kind of forget that the reason why we say this about Black people and they're more resilient is because there was actual oppression, and let's talk about that and why we were doing that, you know? So, I don't know.
And Sarita, you had brought up a point like before we even recorded about the mental health of students in the classroom, right? And this like glossing over and not understanding what they might be dealing with. And actually, I don't want to put you. You said it so much better than me. Just talking about our universalism and our that music's gonna save us and all that.
Yeah, the music's going to save us, and that the Black music is going to save us, and that the protest songs from the civil rights movement are going to save us. And when we think about it from the perspective of Black children who are watching the same things that us as adults are seeing, and we're terrified and we're panicked and we're anxious, right? And then our children come into these classrooms that are supposed to be their safe places, and people, educators who their hearts are in the right place, but these children are now sitting in lessons where they're learning about the Underground Railroad, and the pain and trauma of the Black experience. And it's like, what impact does that have on their mental health and mental wellness and sense of safety in the classroom? Because it almost starts to feel like they're the lesson. And I don't know, Brandi, if you ever experienced that, but I remember as a kid experiencing, oh, I'm so excited we get to talk about my culture today. And then it's more like when you talk about somebody who's not in the room and you're like, oh, I'm the lesson. I'm not the student. I'm the example. It's kind of a head trip.
You kind of brought up another declaration that I don't really like either. This classroom is a safe space. Who told you it was safe? How can you tell the child that it's a safe space for them? I mean, as a music educator, walking into a PD or a workshop or joining a program or whatever it is, like, I don't assume spaces are safe. That's a luxury I don't have. And I think people really don't understand that.
Yeah, I want to speak to that, Brandy. I just will naturally, whether this is good or not, I'll walk into PD and I'll look for the next person of color, like out of my own sense of safety. And don't feel comfortable when I don't see like anyone. I'm waiting for the door to open and it doesn't, that's when it gets very scary. And then to go back, Syreeta, to what you said about just like the first images that are so often shown in any classroom of Black people, I just think about what happened in the US recently, and going to school the next day, and the job is not for me to teach, it's for me to listen first. And that is still not a safe space. It's a space. And it's a space where is so important to let kids express if they wish, and also honor if they don't, and not push them to do anything either. I think just the performance base of music, of like, okay, now let's put this into a song, now like write what you feel, and now let's turn these into lyrics, like that's one form that isn't always a safe strategy either. And we so much more often need to listen to what they have to say first. And I didn't bring up anything to start, it was just pouring out at first. And I also encourage us all to not always answer in a teacher-y way, or like a typical teacher, like thank you for sharing your opinion, or thanks for saying that, or yeah, I definitely hear you, because I don't know that that's what kids need either. So yeah.
It's like false neutrality. And it kind of goes to, teachers being afraid of, we can't bring up this and we can't bring up this because we can't impress values, be political, such and such and such. And we're conditioned to believe that what we're accustomed to is neutral when it's extremely value based. I mean, everything is, right?
I know I had mentioned just like listening to kids also, but then in addition to teachers maintaining this neutrality, like thank you for listening, I think that we also have to just fight against the urge of answering everything like we know everything because we've read the book. So instead of like saying, okay, well, it's because XYZ happened in history, or whatever we do know, which I'm not invalidating what we already know, but that's not necessarily the answer that is helpful for kids either. So don't feel like you have to answer. And also it's always okay to say, I need to think about that as well, because I'm personally reflecting or emotionally going through this. And that to me is the more, and I did say that a lot, like I have to think about this some more. I don't in like this nervous laughter-y kind of way, because I didn't know how to respond to everything. And I still have students that I need to get back to just have a longer conversation, longer than just with everyone within the time span of our class session.
And I think I just want to speak to that point. Isn't it seems like all of that, like this idea of like safe classrooms and everything like that. It seems, you know, and that vulnerability that of, and transparency, frankly, like of you saying like I don't have the answers. It seems like it all comes back to developing relationships with your students, right? And having a space where we focus on relationships first rather than curriculum. I mean, that's what I see. And that's what I've really focused on this year, because this year they've all these kids have experienced so much, and learning looks so different. And so I've had to make a decision, like, what do I do? Like, what do I emphasize, in order to kind of like have my students feel okay? And it's just like developing relationships, like really focusing on that. And it's scary, because, like I've had to be completely vulnerable and completely transparent, but it's also liberating, because the kids see you as a human, they know you're fallible, and it's just like, yeah, we can sit in it together. It's all right. So yeah, that's what your point brought up in me.
That neutrality is just it's false, right? And I was saying, we like speaking as a black person, black folks know stuff is biased when they go in, but we pretend like what we're accustomed to educationally is the norm. And I have my own children in 7th, 5th, and 2nd grade, and especially my son. My son is like my twin, so we talk about all this stuff together. And he's like, yeah, when I don't hear about black people a certain amount in curriculum, or when I see them, it's represented like this. And, because we're able to talk, he's able to look at what's missing here. Like my teacher's telling me a story and there's something not in the story. that neutrality as far as that goes, and then like Alice was speaking, not just acknowledging as if you're right in the middle. Like you do sometimes, you don't know, or you have certain feelings, or you have that vulnerability Chris speaks to. I think we really have to tear down that idea that schooling as we currently know it is neutral, and that doing something different is leaving neutrality.
I wonder too if it kind of leads towards, if you follow that line of thought of neutrality and go further with it, if it leads to like these ideas and notions that I've seen so much and so often, talking about like toxic positivity, and talking about the universalism and saviorism in music, and like how that just kind of takes it all the way over to a different side of the spectrum, I guess you could say. I don't know.
I mean, that neutrality, I think that's kind of what we're taught in music ed programs. Most music ed programs, obviously not all, but you learn music and then you learn how to teach music, and that's your job and that's what you're good at, and keep politics out of the classroom. That's what we're told time and time and time again, and that's a lot of people's excuses when they're afraid to name white domestic terrorist. Like, I can't say that because that's politicized. It's like, there's nothing political about that. And you not naming it correctly, is not neutral. The Desmond Tutu quote, "Neutral is side with the oppressor." I'm paraphrasing, but and they feel so ill-equipped. I think, like, as a white person, as white people, that's their excuse. I don't have the tools. I don't know what I didn't learn this in school. Google is so free. And I know we did that last time as well. But it is
Still
so
sort
free.
of free. Still sort of free.
It's still sort of free. But like that
And we
emotional.
also didn't learn it on Google, right? We had to go. Oh, I said didn't learn it in Google. Didn't learn it in school. You said
Didn't learn it in school, but you can learn it on Google.
I didn't learn it in school.
You can learn it at this panel. I don't know. That's just like a bad excuse that people are using now, and I wish people would stop.
It's not brave, right? It's not taking initiative, and that's something that we are charged with modeling for kids. And it makes me kind of really reflect on who were the educators that had the most impact on me when I was a kid. And they were always people who did exactly what you've described, which is allowed themselves to be vulnerable, or had conversations with us that were not teacher student, dynamic setup, but it was the teachers who would go, and I had a number. I would say there are 3 or 4 that I can name off the top of my head who are white teachers who, when I was the little militant child that I was when I came out of the room and I would push back, they were always the teachers who go, actually, as a white person, that is not a perspective I've ever considered. And that's really interesting. And can you share more about that? Or I would like to think more about that. And that's so powerful. And it's something that we are all capable of doing if we can have that perspective shift that we've been talking about, right? It's okay to think of your students as your collaborators and your co-conspirators in a lot of ways.
But at the same time, and to hark back to what Chris said, it's not like just relying on your people of color students to do the work. So it goes back to these relationships that you're building, right? Like, I can name the white teachers that I've trusted over the years, a handful, but I knew that they weren't like mining me for my identity, and that was the end all be all. I am representing everything Chinese/Asian American. And I think that's really important to distinguish. Now, as an educator, I know, because I now get a lot of questions about Asian Americanness, and I think about how that relates also to Black Lives Matter and all these different nuances. And how do I navigate that? And I always want to share with the kids that this is my perspective and share my positionalities as well. I think that's something that we don't do enough. Like, what are the things that I've read? What do I know about? And that's not something, in my opinion, that should be shielded from kids, even young kids.
I mean, it's all about that ego, and it's one side or the other. Like, a teacher never wants to admit that they're wrong. They never want to your perspective, especially if it's coming from a kid, because what do kids know, you know? But on the, on the other extreme side, when they rely solely on the kids for their position, like relying on their positionalities to teach the rest of the class, like there's a happy medium where you're not expending the labor of your students and you're also meeting them where they're at and where you're at. Like, deal with your emotions. Come on, let's go.
And knowing where you are, US, we have our racialization tends to do like black white binary thing, right? And I think it extends to your white or you're a person of color, and there's a whole problematic thing with that. So even me going into my classroom as a black American descendant of enslaved people, and knowing like I have black kids who just got here, and that doesn't mean I know them because I'm black as well. I have brown children of all different identities, Asian children of different identities. Just because I am a racially minoritized person does not mean that I don't have to have the same humility and openness and understanding of my place as I expect white educators that I'm talking to have with me. Obviously, there might be some connective experiences based on being minoritized, but like just really understanding that there are so many different identity points, and that I'm not gonna be the black child whisperer or the racially minoritized child whisperer just because that's part of my identity.
So I've been reading quite a bit on just like the most recent kind of iteration of these asset pedagogies, right? Like culturally responsive teaching, culturally relevant pedagogy, all these things. And it's culturally sustaining pedagogies. And the way that this differs, are y'all familiar with that? Culturally sustaining pedagogies? And so it's all about honoring like the intersectionality of students' identities, understanding that, like all these ID points. And it offers approaches of how we as teachers can recognize that, and we can create spaces that allow students just to be themselves rather than them being sorted in our own monolithic understandings of what this particular culture is and does. It's like, no, kids are, they're part of their heritage culture, like they're part of global youth culture, like all these different things. And so so that's what I've been kind of like grappling with recently, just just like honoring kids like where they are at. Tate Vega would call it like their nexus of multi-membership, like just their intersectionality. Crenshaw would say so.
Man, that is, that like we try so hard, like humans put things in categories so easily in order to understand things, to ask people to do that. I love it, but man, I can just imagine how that would just blow some people's like brains trying to figure that out. That's cool.
So much process. And I like, Chris, you talked about it's like you know how we feel about trite lists, right? But it's like if you're gonna have a list a list that makes you process without handing you a thing, that's a list. And at the same time, knowing you've got to get in there, you have expectations. One thing I loved about being an elementary music teacher was without my subject being tested in the same way as other subjects, and often having an administrator who did not have expertise in that area and them acknowledging that, you can subvert as much as you want. And like I tell my kids, this is what is considered the standard, and this is how we have our classroom community, and this is why I think it's important. This is what I want you to remember, because you won't always be with me and you might get something totally different. Just understanding when we have space to do that, and not we're brainwashing the children. No, we're just like not having to be beholden to the same level of restriction and the false neutrality that might be tested elsewhere, right?
And I think that's the impact of educators. Like those are the types of lessons that children will remember more than, if I were to ask my husband, who's not a musician, if he remembers note values from elementary music class, pretty sure he does not. But if there's so a lot of times children remember the connection with the teacher, I guess is what I'm trying to say, versus the lessons. And so if we can really kind of keep that as our focus, is like, what is the impact? How are these children leaving this experience and taking something with them that they can carry for a long time. And I try to sort of form my lessons and my approach around that versus got to hit these standards, got to make sure that they have these standards. I mean, I'm like you, Brandi. I had a lot of sort of autonomy in my classes that way, which was pretty awesome.
I think what we see are teachers who are, so what you're speaking about, Syreeta, is hard to quantify, right? It's hard to measure. It's hard to see it happen over time. And so teachers who aren't thinking that way or are struggling to find a way to justify it or to measure it, that's hard. But going through and looking at chair tests, that's easy. I can do that. Like, I can just listen to that. So yeah, I don't know. It's like, what are you willing to step out of your box, a little bit and figure out some other things? Is this the way that we want to teach music, to experience music with our students?
And I think that goes back to, like what I talk about, like this process is messy, right? Like teachers want the clean list, but how can we meet them there? Like, how can we, just to kind of bridge that gap, like from their linear thinking, to like, hey, be comfortable with this process. Like what resources can we use to walk them through that,
Right.
And that's because teachers, they need resources. Like they that's what they want. Like being a teacher, it's time consuming. There's a lot of stuff, so we revert back to the list like things. But yeah, so.
Well, I always wonder what drives teachers to think they need to teach that way, right? There has to be something that drives them to teach that way. And maybe that's what we need to be talking about. Changing.
Well, what
can, oh.
Is it okay if I just have just real quick, just Brandi, because yeah. So there's this scholar, Susan Nolan, who writes about this idea of situative motivation, and so in their study, Nolan Warren Horn, what they did is they looked at pre-service teachers. They looked at what are your motivations here. Then they took those pre-service teachers into their like teacher TEP world, as they called it, like student teaching. It's like, so what's your motivative here? And they followed them all the way when they became teachers, and like, what's your motivation here? And motivation is situative, right? Like there's different contexts. We're motivated by different things, it seemed to be like in their student like world, in their pre-service world, they were just like, yes, I'm motivated. Like I'm idealistic. I want all these things to happen and I'm going to do this. But once, they get into a real world teaching situation, like into their site, wherever they are, they're so beholden to all these different standards, and you could just see like how it changes their motivation. So how do we kind of intervene in that middle process and start changing the structures at the site level to be like, hey, allow them to do what they want in this.
Well, one thing that makes me think of is also, I know that I've read somewhere that when pre-service teachers are thinking about teaching and pursuing it and going through all their courses, so much of it is recreating their own best memories within the classroom when they were learning music. And of course, not to invalidate that is so important, and we all have our own individual memories of why we are in this field and what drives us and our favorite teachers and so forth. But also going back to what you said, Chris, you said about culture sustaining pedagogy is where you are right now, and that's different from where we're from, right? And there's so much of an emphasis of the past, and like we're not just I mean to say not just in music education, but just like culturally where we're from, right? And we keep looking to the past, and so much of it is actively listening to kids in this moment. So beyond the conversation, beyond what kids are listening to, like what's popular is one venue, right? That's one way to go at it. What do you hear when you get home with your family, when family members are like cooking in the kitchen or doing other things, things that aren't just like, okay, I hit the standard, or I went home and I did standard one, with my kid, because no one acts like that in real life. But I want to acknowledge that music teachers need to be brave. Music educators need to be brave to be able to embark on this work, because it's not going to be easy, and it's not always going to be met with like applause at all. And that's where we have to constantly go back to this wokeness and this obtaining knowledge. Knowledge isn't always in the books, it's in the conversations that we're having with our own family members, our own circles. And so what are you listening to, John? And how is that influencing what you're thinking? Because I know that I personally, with all that's going on, actually have not listened to a ton of new music. And there's like almost a separation that occurred for me personally that I just could not make that connection. I think that like so often we think, or people who are not music educators will think, well, you always have music. You can always want to play your instrument, and you can always like put on your headphones and hear this song and you'll feel better. And while that works sometimes, like I definitely feel like a schism of some sort, just mentally and emotionally. And if our kids are feeling that, what are we having, what conversations and how are we hearing them? I know that opens like a huge web, but I think it is speaking to what's necessary.
And I know for music educators, you know, this is uncharted territory, right? Like, this is not how we were taught to teach music. This is not, you know, something that we were able to go to school for. But like, it is in music though. Like when we fell in love with music for like probably some collaboration part of music, you know, unless we're exclusively soloists. I'm not. But so like, how do we take those aspects of music education that we don't really think about? You know, we're thinking about scales and notes and NISMA and, you know, preparing for festival. But like the collaboration aspect of it and like the community aspect of it, like how do we bring that into the classroom rather than teaching notes? Because, you know, I can't even teach notes right now because I'm doing a hybrid, and like, so there's so much extra space for that like social emotional learning that isn't music that we need to acknowledge and use as collaborators.
I think,
and John, oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think adaptability is so important, and a degree of I don't know if playfulness is the term, because I don't mean playfulness in terms of everything's fun, but just in terms of like trying things in a not a childlike way, but just trying things. So, okay, so my path to music ed was kind of reversed, right? I got hired as a upper elementary music teacher before I went to school for music ed, because it was one of those circumstances where I was teaching private lessons, and then one of my students, their school, they needed a music teacher. I interviewed and I got the gig. So I came into it from a very like, oh, okay, so they've hired me to share with the children what I know as a musician and as a person who loves children and a person who reads a ton, but I didn't come into it with the same music ed background that a lot of my colleagues have. And so that meant that, and I know Brandi laughs at me all the time because I'll see teachers say, well, if we can't use whatever this minstrel song is, how are we going to teach eighth notes? How are we going to teach 16th notes? What are we going to use? And it always like baffles me, because I'm like, write a song, like make up a song, or put on, you know, I teach eighth notes, I teach soul claps, and I play Sir Duke for the kids, and I have them clap, you know, on the 2 and 4, and then I have them clap on their eighth notes. And it's not something that is based on lesson plans, but it is something that gives them the same information. And it's because I'm playing around and improvising and going, okay, how did I learn this stuff? And obviously there needs to be a balance of all of those things. And I'm finding that balance now, that I am going more of the traditional music ed route, but I'm also finding, as I'm getting into that method, how constricting it can feel. And it's making a lot more sense to me that I see other music educators sort of panic if they don't have in their repertoire what they were taught in school. This is how you teach this concept with these songs. So that adaptability and that kind of confidence to try things differently. I think I have a lot more empathy and understanding than I did at the beginning, where I was just like, you can write a song using Sola and make it up and it'll be fine. Or you can choose this Drake song for that. And I didn't have any kind of boundaries around that. And now I think I'm kind of understanding more where the panic and the lack of confidence comes in for a lot of people.
I can relate to that a lot. For those watching, Syreeta and I have some really similar things background wise, and kind of coming into music on the back end, though, you know, Syreeta, you and I tend to be in different areas as far as like performance wise, but a lot of stuff with improvisation, and you know, we came to music ed more through performance and private teaching and pick the other stuff up on the back end. I can see the importance of some of the more formal stuff and some structure it provides, but I really agree with that. And I have to gain more empathy, you know, going through training with teachers and talking to them about things that to me were just like, I mean, you just do that because that's what you do with music, right? But from a performance standpoint, and having other teachers saying, you know, when I studied music ed, we did such and such and such and such and such. And so now they're having to restructure their thinking. And sometimes I think it has been easier to learn a music approach and then learn pedagogy than to learn pedagogy if you didn't have enough time to learn musical approach. And they cram 1 billion credits into music ed programs, so often they don't get the time. Or at music ed peers who, like, I'm majoring in jazz studies, they wanted to do jazz, but like the conflicts meant that they didn't get the same level of experience even if they had the amount of credits to devote to performance or whatever. And if we are having kids be music makers, right, but we're not situated as music makers ourselves, and we're situated as exclusively educators, like that dichotomy keeps getting pushed that I don't think is realistic at all, then you know it makes that fear, and it can be really, really overwhelming. And having to incorporate a lot of the anti-racist stuff we talk about, decolonizing stuff we talk about, having performance fear, just all that stuff mushed together. Yeah, able to be more empathetic about where all of that can come from.
And I think, you know, again, going back to this idea, it's just like resources, just like how can we provide teachers with resources, you know, to help bridge the gaps in their thinking, you know, like yeah, I went to this it's like an online class, like through Washington Ethnic Studies Now. It's this really cool organization that's looking at ethnic studies training for teachers. And the approach of the person facilitating that, it was just incredible, you know. And we had a discussion on ontological distance, so just like, you know, the distance between our thinking and our practice, you know, and how do we bridge that gap and make our practice more congruent with our thinking, you know. And it just boils down to resources, you know, like it just boils down to resources. And how do we develop really effective resources so teachers can reflect on what they're doing, have, you know, songs that, you know, access or materials and approaches that allow them to be creative, you know, like all the, it's just like resources. That's all it comes down to.
Chris,
So
you're naming so many resources yourself, like just in this talk right now, but so many of them are not in music education, and I just want to like flag that as something that we so often will only look in the field of music ed for resources, and that's problematic in itself because the bulk of my reading is outside of music education, and I just learned so much because it's just the same thing as like, oh, I read something and that sparked an idea, and not like I will find the answer in the text itself. Like it's not like I can lift this quote now, but rather that made me think of something that I would not have thought of if I just read about it in music.
right, yeah, it's like, what do you do when the resource is yourself? So how do you instill that? And I think that goes to what Brandi was saying about our connection to performance. That's what we need to do, which connects to what Syreeta's talking about, seeing affordances, seeing flexibility, seeing being able to be adaptable, because we are rooted in being able to be a performer, a competent performer, and then being able to connect those things to things that aren't necessarily like first this, then this. It's like, here's this, 2 years later, oh yeah, now that kind of makes sense. So, you know, it's just like, I don't know. And it's like what you said too, Chris. It's not linear, right? The learning isn't linear. So
And John talked about that collaboration, just if your music making is rooted in that anyway. There's so much to be gained from understanding what makes musical community outside of just dealing with other music educators or having a professional development that's here's how we can turn this thing into a classroom specific event, right? One thing I absolutely love about playing old time music is a lot of it is like sitting in a circle outside and playing and have someone going, this tune is called such and such and such and such. I learned it from this fiddler from this place. And back then, such and such and such. I have a bandmate, Dean Barber. We play as a duo sometimes. And we've sat and talked. And then we get back to like Civil War, right? And then he's talking about war technology during the Civil War. Like, it's just, this is not something you would have thought of in a music ed thing, right? There is a really great educator out, well, Chris, you know, Juliana Vita, and she did a presentation at AOSA, the American Orchestral Work Association's conference 2019, and it was on a particular Brazilian tradition, and it was the first time I had seen a performance that wasn't rooted in white Western European stuff, not performance, like a presentation at a very major or central music ed conference where there was so much rooted in just like the stuff behind it and things that typically in our book, this is a song from Japan and you play it. And that's like the sentence, right? Or it's just like a little bit, or that might even be just like letting you know where that place exists. But having something where it's like, here are the pictures of the people, here is how that developed, here is how, you know, and it was so woven into it. And I think that is something, you know, going back to Chris and Alice talking about resources is when we develop our professional development in our conferences, having narrative woven in a way that we're not really accustomed to, bridging that distance between the like knowing and the doing, and like there's a story and a narrative and something, and it really does actually matter that we we know what's behind this, not because it might be a terrible song to use, but because it's really important. Like we talk about Kumbaya. You get to teach about Gullah Geechee people don't even all know that that's a culture and the amazing history and things that are happening with the culture because they're just singing the song, and that disconnect is there. But they know that do, mi, and la are in it or whatever.
That's something I've been able to observe a lot with my own dad, who's a blues musician, and not a formally trained musician, right? His father was a blues musician, so I've ever since I was a little kid, I remember him coming to school and doing like assemblies, and he would play songs for the kids, and he still does it now. And he came to my son's school a couple of years ago and did it, and it was so fascinating to watch how he talks about the history of blues music from his own perspective, because it's so different from how it's taught in traditional music ed spaces, right? And so like when my son was learning about blues in his school, he was taught that it's like music that comes out of pain and music that comes out of sadness, versus when my dad is talking to the entire school, he says, you know, do you ever feel like you're so mad about something and you just want to like scream it out, and then when you talk about it you feel better and you feel lighter, right? And so he's talking about why it's so cathartic to sing the music and how it makes him feel, or how it makes people feel to listen to it. Or he talks about, you know, how dancing and smiling can lift your mood. And so there's so much humor in blues, and there's so much joy in blues music, and it's so different from how oftentimes it's taught in the music classroom. But here you are having somebody who is truly a culture bearer sharing this, and it's exuding joy and happiness and fun and silliness and all of those things that are present when you dig into the music a little bit more than the surfaced level of, you know, the 12 bar blues that we learn.
And you said the magic word dance, right? From a separation standpoint, we have a lot of things being brought into the classroom where the music is literally dance music. The history of it is dance music, and we strip that away, right? Like old fiddle tunes and blues music. Blues is like so heavily dance associated, right? And these historic dance forms that accompany all this. And my most formal music education training is mostly a certain type of European descent, often New England or Appalachian, white Appalachian, because that's a whole other thing too. Based type of dancing, and we and our play parties and stuff that of course happen in different areas. But even knowing that such and such is a dance form, jazz was a dance form, and a dance form. It was a music that had dancing with it, different than jazz dance. But just knowing that that's such a big part of it, and there are reasons that things have turned more into sitting and listening, and just like you said, including all of that from like a culture bearer standpoint. And again, I love it. I go, I can go to my students and be like, we square dance to such and such. Y'all know that song we did, like just whatever it is, not separating that. It makes me think of, I talked to Jared Shield, some of you might know from being a co-creator of Hip Hop Music Ed. He's up at Berkeley. He's just like an amazing dude. We had to talk about music education philosophy. And he talked about, first of all, like where knowledge is situated is very important, right? And it was something I think Chris said earlier, made me think of this, but he was like, but like, where are you going with the knowledge? And that whole idea of like, you guys have been talking about situating ourselves in all these different ways, and Chris is talking about being about cultural sustainability and situating our students, and then just like having an idea of where we're going to go with that. That is not the same as our state standard says such and such and such. It's paying lip service to say that music is all these grand things and then reduce it to whatever the music literacy skill was, or music is a way to build to boost math and English scores. Now Lorelai's eyes gonna twitch because it's not even true.
Well, there's an article that just came out like yesterday that talks about that exactly. Again, that it brings the Mozart effect back into play. I haven't read it, but keep an eye out for that because it just came out yesterday. And so I'm like, here we go again, Mozart effect. Like.
I think we do damage when we say the word traditional, because that it's really white. Like, it's not actually traditional. Yeah, it's not inclusive, and that what we're learning is how to teach white.
There's so much language stuff, right? It's like, what is folk? What is traditional? What is such and such? We have to we can't hold tightly to those terms and say they mean a thing.
Yeah,
they can mean another thing.
And I think also just about like how you all have now, like, or many of you have shared personal anecdotes of how you've learned music or how you teach music, and so much of it is like sharing an experience, sharing a story with one another. Those are the songs that I also remember from my own music education. It wasn't like, okay, now like Bach concerto, let's go. And I think it's important to make that a point in our classrooms, that it isn't like you learned a song today. You learned a story, or you learned about someone who has created that, right? And continuing to make that be normalized, so that when they are older, they can say, well, but what is, so can you, like, I don't want to just learn a song. Can you tell me a little bit more? And then empowering kids to question and challenge when it does come up, if it comes up, which unfortunately and inevitably, I mean, I often tell my oldest elementary kids to ask questions to their future educators about anything, really, and to ask me anything. And they have the power to do that. So it's so important to make sure that they know that that's the case.
Yeah, I think too, when just to touch a bit on what Brandi was talking about with that disconnect between the culture bearers and then the formal training and the missing pieces there. And so something I see a lot in, whether it's, teaching my jazz studies in higher ed, or lessons about hip hop or lessons about blues. It's like, if my father was sitting in this class, would he understand the way that this music that is part of him is being taught? Would is the language being used even something that the culture bearers would recognize? Um, because I do, you do see such a distance between, there's the academics and there's the musicians, right? And if we can't, if you are teaching about hip hop, for example, and you've not ever been to a live hip hop show, you've never sat in the studio and watched somebody produce the music and sat with them and collaborated, how do you effectively, because kids can pick up, right? Kids can pick up whether this is something that is, you're teaching it from a perspective of having experienced it versus teaching it by rote. So I think that's a huge part of it too. And so I'm pretty intentional in my classes in terms of, if I'm going to present a song for a lesson or a concept, I'm more likely to pick a song that I have a personal connection with. I know the background of who these artists are, how they got there, versus, picking something off of the internet. And if the kid asks a question, if I'm teaching an Earth, Wind, and Fire song, and a kid is like, "My parents love Serpentine Fire. What do you think about that one?" And being like, "Oh, I've never heard of that. I only know this one song that I am teaching you, and I cannot have any conversations beyond that."
So you go, let's go listen to it now.
Yeah, and it's so much more than just like pronouncing the words in other languages correctly. Also, I think that so often it's just like, okay, I don't want to butcher the word, and as long as I haven't, I've done the due diligence. And then I also, because I feel like this can never be said enough, that if you aren't close to a cultural bearer of a song, then find out how you can be, and then pay them, because so often like the labor is not free, and it's so important to value that. Yeah.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because I can see white people like taking that and running with it, like, oh, well, I'm not a culture bearer, so like I can't teach it properly, so like let me just stick to what I know, and what I know is Jump Jim Joe. No ma'am. Because if you don't know it, go get a primary source. Hello, what? Like, hire someone. What? Hire a
And
group.
I
Like,
and there are, like, I think there's this idea in white music education that cultural music is like from a long time ago, but there are
right.
so many people in the world alive today who are creating this music, and so find them.
And that it's more real if it's old, right? I saw a teacher speak really negatively about a Future and Drake song. This is not a this is not me sharing my opinion about Future or Drake. But they like use that to make the point of like people having made real music in the past, and people now just like calling themselves musicians, right? But like, what aesthetics are we being held to when we're saying that, like, and all classical music ain't good just because it's classical music and it's written in a very intricate manner or whatever. It's not all complicated. It's not all this. And classical, that's a whole thing about that term. I have to share that Lauren Kajikawa article is really good about the possession of classical music and its place in university. But yeah, we have to kind of like separate all that stuff, because goodness, yeah.
Especially if you connect with kids who, you're disparaging the music that they love and that sparks something in them.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna lose them, right?
It's real music, and it's not real music to validate some other thing you think is actually real. Like, it's just really really good music, right? And like your Earth, Wind, and Fire example, and to combine that with what Alice said, it's okay to be like, oh, I don't know that. I do a lot of like, oh, let me Google, make sure the words are okay, and now let's listen to it, and I'm like, hey, thank you, this is nice, we're gonna do something with this, just be open to that.
It made me think of a Pod the Score PD of some sort that I went to recently, and I think it was Eric Jimenez who said exposure creates creativity. And then also just ask the question, is the music present in your life soundtrack? And I think that's something to always ask for ourselves and for our students too, and not answer the question for them.
Well, and also like if as John was saying, when there's the idea of like, oh, I actually don't know any of that, and I don't know culture bearers, so I can't even touch it. It's like that's one of the things that's come out of COVID and quarantine is that we are a Zoom meeting away from being able to connect with people in a way that we didn't have the time or the space to do. So there really is so much access right now, but you gotta pay people.
And there are people for whom it's exchange. Sometimes it's literally financial. Sometimes it's exchange. Or, you know, if you build a relationship with someone and say, you know, I'm doing this and I really don't want to misuse it. You know, it's all so much. And I don't want to. Gosh, we could talk forever, but we have to get like to a little bit of an ending point. I kind of I think a good last question is kind of like is situating ourselves or whatever, you know, given that all these things are going on and we have these concerns, you know, like where are you feeling you're at right now, and kind of where you want to go with it, and I can lead by example. Like right now I am I wish I had a like a flash drive hole in my head so I could just like load everything onto it because I'm learning so much, and so much about my own identity and so much about how music ed works. And what I really want to do is be able to, you know, like Chris said, find a way to share and have those resources and have that understanding there, so we're not in the position that Alice is in, where we keep saying these buzzwords happen, we got to the ending point and we're good, and then we're perpetuating that cycle.
I can say for me, I think where I'm at and what I've been spending a lot of time trying to focus on is prioritizing the mental health and mental wellness of all kids, but particularly the kids who are the most um, affected in their everyday life by what's been going on in the political and social landscape. Because the last thing I want to do is have traumatized children come into my room and I'm thinking that I'm uplifting them by playing a song that glory or whatever it may be, and it really just takes them to a place that they emotionally cannot manage and handle. So I'm really trying to focus on tenderness, taking care of the whole child, and really kind of trying to tune into what the most vulnerable of the group need to feel fortified in those spaces.
You definitely took the words straight out of my mouth. I think going back to that, the idea of like a safe space, a safe classroom, and that is not done by a flag on your wall or a pin on your shirt. And like, how do we, especially like we're talking about mental health a lot now because kids are sitting and staring at their screens all day. It's like, how are we incorporating that? How are we musicking with the kids and also not musicking with the kids and just being there with them and present, um, and not worrying about posting a black square on June 2nd, you know, meeting them where they are, being honest with yourself about where you are and getting your ego out of the way.
Yeah, I think for me, it has been a very slow realization, but now a more meaningful one as far as understanding where I am with who I am and what I am and why I think the way I do, and then seeing how that propels me to act a certain way within my class, within my interactions, just how I go through life, and just constantly kind of deconstructing that in every step I do. Because I say a lot of things. Do I really follow what I say, and am I actually following up with what I do? I think it's kind of where I'm thinking and moving towards.
For me, I've been doing a lot of long-term reflection to earlier in my own teaching career and just thinking like that wasn't okay what I said or what I did, and especially like current me would just be like, what are you doing? Get out of the classroom. But using that as a place of empathy to understand that everyone's journey and process timeline is so different, and also similar to Syreeta, the mental health is something that just must be to continue to be discussed in the same vein as music education and decolonizing work occurs. It's not separate. it's not something that can just be categorized differently. So if I'm feeling joyful today, but tomorrow I don't, I want to honor that. And I also want to honor that for our kids, because I did not grow up in a pandemic, so I could never understand what that's like. And I think that's important for teachers to just recognize. And then just also like empathy for ourselves. We are so hard on ourselves on finding the answers, and we say like no lists and no this, and in a way like we appreciate that too, right? Like we appreciate that you're trying, but also be empathetic and know that it will take time. It can be frustrating, so I feel all of those things in flux depending on time of day. Time, yeah.
I mean, for me, where I'm at in all this is like I just want to focus on relationships. That's all I want to do right now. You know, just focus on getting my students just to feel connected, you know, to something. And like you said, just allowing grace for ourselves, and things musically are not going to be the same, but it's a great opportunity for us to try things out, right? Yeah, but yeah, so that's where I'm at. Just relationships and allowing space for grace, and just being flexible and trying new things. That's where I'm at right now.
So thank you again for joining me. Y'all are amazing. I missed your faces live. I'm so happy we're together. I hope that those who are watching are able to have some guidance by what we're talking about, just even if it opens up for their own processing. Again, we're Decolonizing the Music Room, 501c3 nonprofit, trying to increase equity out in these music ed streets. Please check us out at www.decolonizingthemusicroom.com, on Instagram at Decolonizing the Music Room, or on Facebook. Please join our Facebook group. Please consider donating, because we are trying to grow and make sure that we are properly compensating everyone for their work in making more programming. So thanks so much, everybody.